this point, we're going to introduce a new voice, but also a very significant voice to the conversation. The curator of the show, Alfredo Cramerotti, who I mentioned earlier. And Alfredo is presently director of MOSTYN, the art gallery in Wales, which is unusually adventurous in its engagement with contemporary art and artists. And it has to be said that in this day and age, engaging with religious or indeed biblical subject matter is adventurous by its very nature, and that plenty of art galleries don't go near it. But Alfredo's been a very, very significant creative contributor to this process alongside the readers and the artist. But came to it a little bit after it had kicked off. So Michael's Leverhulme artist in residency in our department, which lasted for a year, had been running for some little time before I remember hearing Alfredo's name. And Michael and he are old friends, but suddenly we realized that we might have the advantage of Michael's address book and the input of Alfredo into this process, and I have to say it's been invaluable. Alfredo, thanks for being part of the project, and thanks for being here today. And you have open floor to reflect as you want on this.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for everyone to being here. You might wonder what is the precise work of a curator, really, especially actually with this type of projects. It's a bit of a mixed thing, really, because I found myself between the artist and the readers, so the artistic sort of urge to create something, and the structure who was hosting it, and also the sources of the material, actually, who provided the tools, actually, for Michael to work with. And I was in the middle, and I am in the middle when I work with artists, because there's no other way around, really. It's a matter of creating a context and creating the possibility, and sort of I wouldn't say fine-tuning, but sort of being more a soundboard, actually, for the artist to actually realize fully what he or she wants to realize. And in the talk, actually, we did after the opening, I was mentioning the idea of translation, which I think is still, it wasn't really actually fully discussed at the time. So I would like actually to throw it back at you, but also at you. The idea how you translate something that is, kind of how do you translate a religious topic into a technological output and being sort of experienced as an art exhibition. So there is the translation of the content, of course, but also the translation in terms of different languages, but also the translation of those languages into a physical environment. And also the further translation about that experience into something that the audience actually can interact with, and they can absorb, and they can reply, in a way, back to the artist or the organization or the curator or whoever, actually. So this idea of the translation is actually quite a key point for me, and that's why I was interested to be involved in the first place, because it's something that I found myself to negotiate every day, and you can talk about how you translate the language of an artist into something which is accessible, and it can actually inject responses in a meaningful way, and that's in itself is a big job, really. So I just park this question here for a moment, and I will ask you to go back afterwards, and to you as well. And the second point, I was picking up actually maybe what Michelle started to talk about about this idea of the time element. It's about the tension of the time between the past and the present, and sitting at the edge of the foreseeable future. the time element is also another thing that I would like to pick up, because this whole work and why we're here today, it comes because Michael spent a year in your department. And that is quite a long time. Generally speaking, actually, when we work on something, actually, you talk about weeks or months. It's difficult to talk about years, actually, in approaching something. It's more likely that we talk about years when you buy a house, really, but not when you do a certain work. And the time element, I think, is quite important. And also, Michel was mentioning before about the Book of Revelation being a sort of images of human constants. Did I get it right? Yeah, my kind of a bad English. and that's an interesting thing, actually, because it is about starting from what we know to what we don't know yet. But it's also being aware, actually, that every generation has its own take on basically the same things. You know, the matter of life is more or less stays the same. It didn't really change from the time when the Book of Revelation was written until today, but every generation found its own peculiarity and its own sort of angles to discuss it and to articulate it in a different way, which is, I think, what is the work of the artist about. This finding way to articulate those sort of matters in different ways every generation, every time. That was the two main questions to you, and then I would like actually to pick up a few things that the readers has, or the speakers were talking about before. And one of it was actually Aaron, you were mentioning the idea about resistance, about how do you resist, but at the same time playing according to the rules of the game. And you were talking about an institution or a university, but it could be applied to any environment. You can talk about, you know, family. You can talk about whatever, really. How do we make sense somehow of our own sort of existence, resisting a bit against the grain, but still actually being able to realize that little bit, and it's something that is interesting because. Then Ben picked up the idea of the binary as effective tools, you said. And effective tools in sort of a creating this kind of a possibility to talk about that are very, you know, there is the black and white, you know, they're kind of they are kind of opposite, that they kind of force us to either choose or discuss that space between black and white. And so how do we manage actually to create artwork that resists the function or resists that specific interpretation, either black or white? It's, in a way, is a little metaphor for what is the resistance at large in our life and in our sort of areas of our living. And the other thing that I picked up from the previous speakers is, well, there is actually the idea of the like, the idea that's how we like something, and we like something, but we know that it's not the same thing as that thing. So we like it, but it's not identical, it's not the same thing. And I was connecting to what Aaron was mentioning about how do we combine the technological sublime with the religious sublime. So is it a kind of a likeness? It's not the same thing, but sort of you can sort of compare these two. And the third thing, actually, that also I put it there as a point to discuss, it's a bit actually maybe a controversial point. But I just got it sort of to think about it. The technology, I mean, specifically the techne concepts that Simon was talking about, actually, and the remark of Michael about the neutrality of technology, which I do agree. I mean, it can be used for good or for ill. But the thing I was questioning is, are we really controlling the idea of technology, or is it the other way around? And I was thinking that, you know, maybe as human beings, we are sort of coded in order to push technology forward all the time. And we never stop, we never renounce our knowledge. We are not able actually to say no to our knowledge, and we push it forward every time. So maybe there is something there that, in a way, there is actually is the idea of technology controlling us, rather than vice versa. But it's just speculation. I just thought actually, because there was, you know, starting from Heidegger and the idea of technology or poetry actually, I thought that there was something that actually maybe is good to just put it there and see what happened. Well, I think I just started my question. So the idea of translation, I would like Michael actually to comment on it. How do you find this translation, if it was?
For this project, the issue of translation was certainly on my mind, as you know, Alfredo. And the first thing to say is that in any translation, in any good translation, one has to be respectful, in my opinion, to the source material. Whether that's the book, in this case the book itself, or the scholarship that was sort of behind each of the readings to which I was responding to. And that certainly played a lot on my mind in terms of wanting to produce things that not only spoke to sort of my peers in the contemporary art scene, but also that the readers here and the people sort of gathered here today that come from, say, a theological and academic background would actually go see the works, and that they would feel that they were good translations, for lack of a better sort of description. So that certainly was on my mind, and sort of I also was thinking about sort of translation in terms of this idea, which I think a lot of the works play with this idea that the book has just always been in this process of continual translation, you know, through different time periods, through different technologies, through different sort of social contexts. And I certainly wanted to play with and sort of tap into that history, because I very much agree with Michelle that we had all these discussions, and she just would always frame about sort of the here and the now, but in terms of what's going to pass. And sort of, I think that is a reoccurring theme, not only in this context, but with a lot of sort of art contexts as well. So I wanted to play with that.
That includes also translation of historical art form into
Absolutely.
Sort of a contemporary or cutting edge, if you want. I mean, there is a good. It's worth to note actually that in the exhibition you can read everything as, you know, sculpture, painting, etching, and stained glass. It's just made with other sort of materials and tools and processes, but you can read it as such.
Absolutely, and I think if some of the technologies that I'm using in this show are truly cutting edge, the things like, for those that have seen the show, the lattice work skulls that have been 3D printed by colleagues of mine at the Technical Institute of Berlin. To get those to be, I mean, basically, until a few months ago, those were not printable. They were not makeable. According to my colleagues there, they said, well, if you went to the best commercial firms in 3D printing, 9 out of 10 would just tell you to go away. They'd say that these aren't printable. The director of the lab and several of his PhDs spent the better part of 2 months working with me and my colleague Baker, who's right there with his hand up, sort of working through different combinations. They're using a £500,000 printing system, sort of doing things like minor manipulations just to make this possible. So, I mean, certainly that's some of the technologies we've used in this, but it's a sculpture at the end of the day. It's sort of pushing what's possible, and one of the things that I like in sort of working in the traditional forms, as you say, is because I think the power of new media, really one of the great powers of new media, is that it gives us the ability to recontextualize and sort of re-question our history and our process, that sort of our journey as we've gone before. And certainly as an artist, I like to play with that tradition, those histories, and be part of that conversation.
It's amazing how much effort it takes to generate those forms, right? Because those are things that, in a sense, you know, one of the critiques we always hear about the use of new media is, oh, I could do that, or, you know, it's so easy, or it gets generated, and yet here you have, it takes there's tremendous amount of this whole brain trust and the monetary resources and the craft, all of that, to produce those two things, which actually, to make by hand, would have been eminently makeable within 2 days, right? So the amount of effort to actually use technology to form into this handmade product.
Can I ask you to the readers, how was for you this idea of translation of your expertise, let's say, about the book into an exhibition format? And it was interesting because actually when we asked the readers actually to give the reading, we open up to any possible forms of make a reading, that they could do a, you know, video compilation, audio file, drawings, whatever. And you all choose a piece of writing, understandably, because it's probably the one you're more comfortable with, I guess. And how was it for you to have that kind of your response translated in those forms by someone who you didn't know probably before as well?
I'm going to speak in a few minutes, so I'm not going to shoot my head.
Okay.
I think for me, one of the things was this idea of having it translated by Michael was just, he was translating what I do in such a sort of esoteric way, and I feel this idea of hidden academic knowledge versus what somebody on the street might be aware of. And the things that we in the academy know, well, obviously the text means this, well, obviously you wouldn't think this. Michael was throwing me all these curveball questions, like, well, if you think about the Book of Revelation, what colours spring to mind, Michelle? No, at a conference, that's not normally the question I would get asked about my work. And it made me realise this process. Michael was using, he was encoding and translating into materials which were totally, I mean, I didn't have a smartphone person, much to his, like, I have one now. So he was translating into materials that were, to me, totally untranslatable. And I was having to translate scholarly opinion and, for want of it, other languages as well. Greek, saying, oh, but Michael, that looks a bit like a Hebrew here. And that meeting, actually, that it's just as much a process of de-translating what's just hidden in scholarship out into something that Michael could ask different translating questions of that would never get asked, and then retranslate it into something that academia, in our discipline, it's more impenetrable than Ugaritic to me, no way. So that would be my take on that.
Aaron?
Yeah, it's not unfamiliar to me. I mean, I like working with artists. I think that's the most fulfilling part of what I do generally. And I think it's more sort of generative. I love the idea. I think there's sometimes, at the lowest level, sometimes you can get where people just say, I'm playing with the idea of, but it's really just that they've learned that as this kind of MFA diction that you use to present yourself as doing an intellectual exercise. But for genuine sort of intellectuals and artists like Michael, I think that's one of the most fulfilling things to do as an academic, is to actually be thinking more creatively about possibilities. And I think it's also it has a strong analogy to what we do theologically. And I think, oftentimes, I don't think it's too controversial to say creating something out of nothing, but which can be a very beautiful exercise, rather than sort of a more sort of pedantic historical exercise. I mean, one of the people who the more nasty reviews of my first book, and what the reviewer said that the second chapter appeared to be largely made up, and I thought, okay, so you did understand part of it. That's the point. It's made up, you know. And so it's nice to sometimes work with people that recognize that as a value rather than thinking you've missed the boat, really.
How was Ben for you?
Well,
you were there from the very beginning, like you discussed with
and for me, perhaps one of the surprising translational effects of working with Michael was that he created as an artist with his particular sets of questions, which were, if you like, none of the questions that the various academic sub-disciplines in our department would naturally have asked. By asking his very direct questions from an outside point of view, got us talking to each other in a way within our sub-disciplines, in a way that was very, very illuminating and constructive. So I learned a lot about my colleagues and the way they approach work from Michael's questions to all of us. See what I mean?
Yeah.
So there was another kind of translation going on, as well as the translation of his ideas into a language we understood, or our language into images that he might make.
It's emancipatory, right? And it allows you also to draw on more personal experience. I think that's the other thing.
Actually, that's absolutely right. So there was another quality of conversation that was as it were licensed by the process, which was one in which we found ourselves discussing both our, as it were, existential motives as well as our academic.
Because you were brought through the agency of art, so it created that space to ask different set of questions.
Exactly.
And the personal testimony, I think we've all said about that. You know, Aaron saying about horses and dinosaur bones. It might not be your first comment that you'd make in a class if you were presenting.
Oh, Aaron was.
Okay, I wouldn't start with that. But I think that there was a lot of personal testimony about our own interaction with revelation, whereas we can often be very objective and say, well, what's the historical truth, or what's your scholarly angle, and we were allowed to run actually with our own interpretive history and really think about that in a way we often put it on hold. I think that we all opened up to doing that and were liberated by it, and I think that does show in each of our pieces that we were allowed to, whilst we've stayed in our no written form that's safe, we've allowed ourselves to actually write in a way that we might not, or be more personal than what we were doing.
I think we felt probably we had to do something good because we were dealing with a proper artist.
Mm-hmm.
I think we probably all felt that we had to then it would have been somehow degenerate of us to then, I mean, like, I've been taking pottery lessons, but I didn't think Michael could really respond to my ceramics work. This saucer that I did, it has some very nice glazing. So I think we all wanted to rise to that challenge, and the only creative language available to us, for most of us, is academia.
Our YouTube videos might have been somewhat lacking.
Good. Well, this is an example of what my work is about, really. It's about creating some sort of being some sort of there in the middle between different parties and different approaches, and it's the work that I like to do it, and it can take many different forms. It can take a sort of a relational form, like in this case, or a more structural form, or a fundraising form for most of the time, actually, if you run an art gallery. But that's what is about, actually, working with artists to sort of try to help them to realize something. I think I ran out of my time, I guess. I'll leave the question, though, here on the table to you, because I would like to pick it up later on during the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can have my chair. So now we're joined by the fourth reader of the Apocalypse, Professor Eddie Adams, who's just actually become a parent again and is only just back from paternity leave. So we're very grateful that you could fit this in. And Eddie's reading was the one that that drew from Michael the response of the final room in the exhibition, the New Jerusalem, which my 12-year-old still talks about, all his friends, the 3D goggles one, and which I absolutely agree with Michelle on, has completely changed the way I read those final chapters of the book and imagine the city. So Eddie, let me invite you to come and respond as our fourth reader.
Thank you very much, Ben, and I'll answer the question about the translational dimension, which I think is a really important issue here. So my experience of this was one which was completely new to me. So this was all new and very exciting to be involved in a project of this kind. My first view of the exhibition was actually yesterday, because for various reasons I haven't been around in London all that much, and my time in London has been a bit limited. So my first viewing of the exhibition was yesterday, and I have to say I was really blown away by it, really was. Especially, of course, when you put the head-mounted display on. That really was something. I'm talking here like a Luddite who's just discovered for the first time the telephone. Well, I do feel a little bit like that. That was completely new technology to me, and when I put it on, just to be transported into another space. Yeah, you were transported in space. It really was something. So I have to say I was really blown away by the exhibition, and nothing in our conversation, Michael, really prepared me for that. I knew, technically what you were doing and the images you were using, but I wasn't prepared for that. So I'm really grateful for that experience, and I'm going to go back and try it on again and so on. That was excellent. In terms of the translational dimension and my reading of the text, I think I should say I've done work in the Book of Revelation. I'm not a Revelation expert, and I'm so glad that my research student, Michelle, here has already exceeded my level of knowledge of Revelation. So I do, which is how it should be for a PhD student who's finishing up writing her PhD. So I do bow to her superior knowledge of the text and its interpretation. As you know, of course, Revelation is a book which is full of imagery and picture language like no other biblical text. And it's a text which has generated lots of artwork in various forms over millennia. And my feeling of most of that, and this is being recorded, so I have to put my opinion on the line here. My view of most of that is that it's extremely disappointing. To me, much of Revelation artwork belittles the text and ridicules the text, if I'm being honest. Much of what I've seen of the Book of Revelation in art. And yeah, I've put my opinion on the line here, but that really is my impression of most of what I've seen of the Book of Revelation, because I think the images and pictures of Revelation are not to be translated realistically. Now, I watched beforehand because I had to do this for a lecture that I was giving, or a talk I was giving. I watched on YouTube. You can watch the Book of Revelation in animation on YouTube, and I encourage you to have a look at that. And I watched a bit again just this morning in preparation for this, and it's an attempt to capture the images of Revelation as realistically as possible in animation. And the whole thing is just completely crass and silly. It really is. So there's a picture of the rider on the white horse, and out of his mouth comes a great big sword. Okay? The imagery of Revelation just does not translate, I think, into that kind of realistic capturing. It doesn't lend itself, I think, easily to that kind of reception. But I think what Michael is doing here is absolutely in tune with the spirit of Revelation, because you're trying to rethink the images and to capture that same sense of what are these images trying to evoke, and using images which are bold and striking and different, but they are recognizable in our world, the technological images and so on. So I really felt that Michael was absolutely in tune with what the author, if you can use the word author of Revelation, was trying to do. And I think that is a much better way, I think, of representing Revelation in art than anything else I've seen. In particular, the New Jerusalem thing. I haven't come across anything like that does it as well as what you do. You know, putting the goggles on and being in that space, and you know, watching the screen with the city emerging from heaven and so on, you have that image and that motion. But it helped me to discover something in the text that I'd never seen before, never really thought about. Now, Michelle will probably say, what? Everyone recognizes that in this passage. But just speaking to Aaron about this actually, putting on those goggles just occurred to me the Tower of Babel. And I wouldn't easily have got that from the text of Revelation, but to me there, in my reading, I pointed out all the different connections between Isaiah and Genesis and so on, but here's something I'd never spotted before in the text, which your artistic representation, it kind of drew me towards that. And there's an evocation going on there that I'd never picked up on. Spatially, you just can't get the spatiality of the image, you know, the 1,500 miles into the sky. You just can't get that, but when you put those goggles on, you begin to get a sense of that. So yeah, I thought that was extremely well done. And just as I wind up here, what I tried to argue in my piece is that the city of the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22 is both continuous and discontinuous with earthly cities. So it looks fantastical and so on, but actually it's got the features of ancient cities. It's got the walls, it's got the foundations, it's got the gates, it's got kind of garden features inside. So it's got all those kind of features of earthly cities, but there are massive discontinuities and the fantastical and so on. And I think you bring that out particularly well with the Jerusalem-based image. I don't know exactly how you did it, but using the map of contemporary urban Jerusalem to generate the images, I thought that really was very much in tune with what's going on in Revelation, and also as I was reading the text and its continuities and discontinuities. So I just have to say congratulations. That's a fantastic achievement, and I'm really honoured to have been part of that and to be asked to be part of the party today. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to respond immediately to that, or save it?
Certainly, because the New Jerusalem piece was the most difficult insofar as that was the one that I was most worried about. And I guess I could start it off with a personal story about an experience I had in my youth when growing up in the U.S. Again, it's that sort of like 8, 9-year-old answering the door. Jehovah's Witness comes, gives me a card that says, you know, do you believe in God, and do you want to go to heaven? And shows me a picture of heaven. And of course, it's the Virginia countryside, which I've grown up in. It's the sort of the white wooden house, the white picket fence, the little white girl playing there in the garden. I grew up in a time of, you know, racial tension, so I kind of looked at her and said, you know, am I invited to this heaven? I was a bit of a snarky kid. And I bring up that story because that was very much on my mind when I was creating this piece. Who am I to actually say what the New Jerusalem would look like? Yes, we're given a description in those chapters, but it is of a city that's unlike anything we can imagine today. It's also, there's very little information. that's given about it. It's almost, again, this, you create your own sort of thoughts of it. And if you look at sort of art that has been created about depicting the New Jerusalem, in some way or form, it actually, in my opinion, falls back to that sort of like the picture of heaven.
Yeah.
It is, and who am I as an artist to actually, that just doesn't make sense. So what I decided to do for that is that I wanted to create something that would evoke the feel of this fantastical, sort of data-driven city. Something that, was very here and now. But the city itself is actually only based on two things. It's the superstructure is actually the translation of the book, of that chapter, into machine code, which then is extruded into 3 dimensions. And in that extrusion sort of algorithmic process, it conforms to all the qualities that are actually listed in the book. So the few sort of definite facts, if you will, about the city, the 12 grades, and sort of the proportions, so on and so forth. Then playing on, Eddie, your idea, which I think is actually a very important one, about your reading deals with this, how it will not just be perhaps something new, but based on the old.
Yeah.
And sort of looking again back to this sort of thing in Revelation kind of that I found as a general sort of concept of this. As you progress from Old Testament to New Testament, as you're going through history, it's this sort of exponential progression of things. So linking it to the here and now, the texture, which then covers that city, is based on map data, which is of the here and now, based on the center of Old Jerusalem. But then the amount of space that was captured of the current day map data is based on proportions of Isaiah. So basically it's sort of going back to that. And of course it's about 1,000-fold roughly, which I think also from reading through things that when Isaiah was written, it's kind of like it was kind of 1,000-fold of what Jerusalem was then. So it's this sort of, again, plays with that history of exponential sort of progression of things. So using those, in a sense, the words, the text of the book itself, to the concrete data of the here and the now, that is, yes, of course, been aestheticized and sort of working with Drew Baker, who's there, was the person on the sort of the technical side of things that we sort of were building this piece together, the VR system. It was trying to be very respectful to the text and not to try to, I didn't want to just, for lack of a better term, make something up. Because who am I to, it was about building this experience which was based on the text, but I was thinking more about the spirit of the text, yes, really, than sort of some kind of literal visualization, yes, of it.
Thank you. I'm hoping that Joan Taylor might be now willing to come up to the front. Joan is another professor in our department of New Testament and Second Temple Judaism, and somebody who both works closely with the texts and the historical environments in which many of the biblical texts were produced, but also is wonderfully engaged with the arts and ways in which different contemporary art forms respond to the Bible. Anyway, Joan, I believe that you've had a chance to look at the exhibition. And, oh, you haven't? Is there anything you would like to say?
I ran in and got the program.
Okay. Is it unfair to ask you to respond?
I think I wouldn't be the right person to respond.
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to it, and it's just fantastic what I've seen of what you produced. And I have to say that last night I was at a special alumni event, and there was someone who was organising it there who had been to see the exhibition and just spoke for 10 minutes about how wonderful she felt it was, and particularly the visualization of the New Jerusalem. And she was, to use Eddie's expression, blown away by it, and was really just so excited and wanted to tell all her friends about it. And I said, well, get in quick, it's not going to be on for so long. And so she she basically just sung the praises of the exhibition and thought it was phenomenal. So I passed that on to you.
Thank you.
It's not an easy space to use either. I mean, it's not an easy space to find, first of all. But I think, you know, having seen a few different permutations.
You mean the New Jerusalem, I imagine.
What's that?
Presumably you mean the New Jerusalem.
Yeah, the New Jerusalem's difficult to find. I'm pretty sure it's in the American South, but I can't be certain where. But it's a doubt, maybe Fort Worth. I think that it's those immersive environments and sort of using the way that they sort of connect and things in a very sort of textual way. Actually, when you look at the map of the exhibition, in some way, more than most cases where it's just a sort of general, sort of generic journey, it actually makes sense the way things are kind of interconnected and the way he's placed those. So I think it's, and also just the kind of embracing the fact that it's a subterranean space and making that work for you, and having the artificial sense of illumination and also some of the kind of haunting or ghastly sensibilities of it. I thought that it sort of showcased a difficult curatorial space in the best possible light.
Yes. And I have to say on that, a lot of the credit of that goes down to not only Alfredo, but also Martin McGrath, who is the exhibition designer. Amazing designer who did the catalog, the wall text, and also worked with Alfredo and I to sort of think about the visitor's journey and what would make sense in terms of taking the 5 different readings, the 5 different works, and then actually building some kind of experience that would give sort of that super narrative that made sense to people coming to the show.
We should be forcing all the students in theology through it.
Yeah. This is a good opportunity to invite questions and comments from you again, if you have them. I know that somebody had a hand up earlier, but I'm not sure. Yes, Jen.
I was interested to know, or wondering, if Michelle touched on kind of being on the cutting edge and you were saying springing into the unknown. Were there any concepts or ideas that you had as an artist that you didn't manage to translate, or that you kind of felt limited by technology?
I continuously feel limited by technology. Some of my colleagues, to take Drew, his name in vain again, it's been a pleasure to work with people like Drew, because Drew has been in VR and visualization, certainly with online systems for the last 20 years. He was writing papers about the need for these things before they existed. I have another colleague in the US that has done things like write the re-entry systems for the space shuttle. So I work with technologists that are at the top level in their disciplines. And one thing that they always tell me is that as computer technology has sort of progressed, there came a point maybe about 5 years ago that average technology is good enough for most people in their uses, and they just say, yeah, Michael, you're never going to reach that. You know, you will always demand more. And I think it's true. People have been really taken by the New Jerusalem piece and that technology, for example, or the 3D printing and sort of the barcodes, and they're, you know, all the different pieces use some pretty sophisticated technologies. But it's always a dialogue with the technology insofar as that the vision that I have for these artworks, it's a conceptual vision. And that is realized through whatever technology is available at the time, because it's always a dialogue between sort of like time, money, accessibility, things like that. When I'm sure the show is going to tour, and when it does, by that time, Oculus Rift, the headset, the commercial release, version 3, will be out. Drew and I will use that. 5 years from now, something else might have come along, and that's fine. So when I actually create my works, I use, I've taken the habit of being very technical. I version them. Because one of the things with, you know, computational media, it's continuously changing. If the work is about an idea, then doesn't it make sense to then use whatever the best technology at the time is to then realize that idea? So the show, as you see now, it's in a certain configuration for the technology of the here and the now, also that particular space. Also, things will change in terms of the feedback, you know, the conversations that I've had with the readers and with Alfredo and Ben, and also the input from people that have come to see the show and people like yourselves will certainly inform the way we would actually present it next time. So this is version 1.0, next time it might be 1.1 or even 2.0, for example. And I think that is just the way I'll always work, and it is a blessing and a curse. Is that
that's a really powerful way to do that, actually, I think, because because otherwise people would look at work that's cutting edge technology and say, that's so ephemeral that you're only going to be able, it only have this kind of reaction for people over the next year or two, but rather sort of actually tapping into this fundamental artistic ambition. I mean, Philip Guston said he wanted to create paintings which lived, not as a metaphor, that lived. And you know, and Kittai would say that you know, the hardest thing was to get rid of paintings or let them out into the world. And there's all these apocryphal stories of Kittai and other artists going around and painting on people's paintings that are in their houses and saying, because their conception of it has changed. They wanted to, you know, or Chagall making the same fiddler painting 4 times because he changes his mind about how he wants it to go. So it's interesting that technology, which could be limiting, allows you to fill this fundamental creative dilemma.
Which is quite unusual in taking in the art. Somehow this idea of the versions of artwork is quite not as mainstream as you can imagine, actually. It's something that the artwork itself is really struggling somehow with the very idea of having multiple versions of an artwork. Because you know, the technology changed, the tools changed, the people changed, the situation changed. And that's something that, you know, computational art is something, it's kind of a getting right at the core of the matter for me.
So, I was just going to comment on the reflection which you made about translation. To answer your question, working with Mike, there's another layer of translation which is the technical translation. So, Mike has gone through and worked with you guys to produce this class, and then back around the ideas and say, geez, Mike, you can't do that. That's just impossible. The computer will melt. Yes. And almost did. So there's a translation level which goes on to achieve what is possible, but only what's possible today, because, as Mike said, tomorrow there'll be a better hardware, better software, faster kit, better representation. So there'll be not a revision, but another translation, almost as if it's being copied out by another hand, and a little bit of embellishment here, and that's not so good, so we'll drop that. So it has the potential to be a living document, just as any solutions should be.
Just to pick up on that, which I think that's a really interesting way of phrasing it right at the end there, that in a sense the way that sacred texts work, you might argue, that in religious communities, is that they are a material object that becomes virtual in the sense that the discourse around the text or stimulated by the text is an event. It's the event of discussion, it's the event of argument, conversation or whatever. And then it becomes concrete again. I suppose in a sense the discussion is concrete because we have bodies, but it then becomes reinstantiated, let's say, in a form of ethical action or resistance or worship or something like that. So the text, as it were, goes from material to virtual and then back to some other kind of material, and constantly does that, so that, as it were, new instantiations are necessary, constantly new and necessary. And some of the ways in which we have become accustomed to treat works of art, at least in the West, is not to appreciate that mobility or that fluidity in the instantiation, so that an artist, a religious artist, might have started with a text, gone into the virtual world of imagining with it, and then made a work, but then that's it stays. Yes, we then interpret that, but what you've done is in a way signal something that's more akin to the way religious communities work with texts, which is constantly to reiterate, and each time a bit differently. You know, the 1.1, the 2.0, and so on is in a way a nice metaphor for what the performance of texts requires in religious communities. So that's...
Ben, I wonder if I could
yes.
just follow directly on from that. Of course, the book of Revelation itself begins with an act of the moment of translation. It's John is caught up in the spirit to another world. And the text invites the reader to make that journey and to be translated with him into this other place, and then inhabit that visionary world. And then the image of the New Jerusalem, which is the bride of Christ, which is the church, descending from heaven to earth at the end, rhetorically returns the reader back to the world at the end. So the kind of the trajectory and the arc of the book of Revelation is one that goes up into the heavens and back down again at the end, which I think mirrors in narrative form the very point that you were just seeking to make about artistic work in kind of worshipping in ecclesial communities.
Thank you. Yes, behind, yeah.
Hi there. I'm not sure what I'm going to say, I think it's going to be disappointing to everything. But I want to pick up on something to do with poesis, really, and art, language, and translation. And we were talking about binaries, and we were talking about black and white. And personally, so back to Aaron's question, my first encounter with Revelations after hearing the word apocalypse in X-Men cartoons was to read it. And it's such a rich piece of writing. And part of that is the strangeness of the translation away from the original language into, in my case, English, and the strange words that have been used. And also, obviously, we have John's potential translation from whatever it was he experienced or saw back into the language that he, or readers at the time, couldn't understand. And for me, that's generative. That mistranslation is really generative, and that's why, when I read it now, thousands of years later, I'm blown away by what I see, despite being grown up on disaster movies and so on and so forth. Revelations is just wow. So for me, decoding Revelations is less interesting than the actual document itself, and the actual kind of weirdness of Revelations. But to talk about coding and sort of decoding, and Simon hit on language as a code, and poesis as what exists is greater than the sum of the parts of the language. That works because I can read English. And so I guess my point is one about literacy, and how if technology codes a way into a territory that I cannot become literate in. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. But as technology increases, the human brain also increases. The word sharp show that it overtakes us and stuff. My question is whether that distance is helpful in the context of the Christian apocalypse. Because for me, the obsession with the Christian apocalypse, which is evident by the generations of bad art that was made by any occasional successful movies. I haven't seen the exhibition, so I'm looking forward to it. I'm not going to marry it tonight because there's an apocalypse sort down in Goldsmiths as well, I'm going to run to. But, what was my point? My point was, does that travelling into a language away from human legibility, is that helpful? As in living with an idea of the end of the world. That's really vague, and I apologise. But that's just the kind of what I picked up over the last afternoon.
Well, the scholars can jump in on this, but I would actually argue, yes, some of the things that I've done, like, for example, Apocalypse Forever, no, you can't walk in. It would be possible for someone to actually learn to decode that. Everything that is in that room is completely reverse engineerable. You could extract the original text from the data code form. You could also get all the 7 translations that are there if you were really good at sort of processing. That's not a problem. So yes, that is, as you say, inaccessible now to people. But through history, was the text actually accessible to people? I wouldn't say no, it wasn't.
I guess it's kind of more my point. Very different role the church played. Back then was one of power, the people who could read, would tell these amazing visual, powerful stories, and terrify the life out of people, and to some extent have a measure of authority or power over them. So,
but sorry, Can I just come in on that? Because it's a very interesting point, but there's an additional complication with this book, that for certain periods of the Church's history, it was a text that was kept from the laity, precisely because it might be disturbing, it might be used in ways that were disturbing to the Church. So Church authority, on the one hand, might be able to use the book as a form of power or control, but at the same time it feared the potential of the book to be used against it because of the rather ungovernable nature of its imagery. And as we still see, the multiple ways in which it can be interpreted when it's given to the general public make it a very destabilizing text potentially, which isn't always in the interests of settled institutional power. So it's got that double edge, I think, and that's part of what makes it fascinating.
And the narrative the narrative thread as well. I mean, it's so sort of, it's all over the place, but it's interesting. So it lends itself, it does all these different sort of serpentine movements. It also lends itself to episodic treatment and decontextualizing something, and that's something that comes across in terms of the question of legibility and illegibility so nicely in Michael's work. I think is when you see these web searches, is that we see visually reified for us the fact that people are selecting out elements and foregrounding those. So we see both that the potential, how these are on the one hand extremely accessible, and there's all these things that are generated consistently by the web resources, and yet it's always a kind of a creative sort of misreading and a selective reading. So you sort of dramatize that kind of act of free interpretation.
And also, you talk about legibility. It depends what you mean by legibility, because obviously when this text was first delivered, it was read out loud. Blessed is the one who hears this, and blessed is the one who reads these words. So this is not a text that people then had, and they're like, oh, let's check what page 4 was saying, right? Yeah. This is something that would have washed over you in an experiential way. And you only had your own memory and your own way of what stuck with you in that congregation and the discussions afterwards, with actually what did have an impact on you. So I think that's something as well that's worth bearing in mind with the exhibition, is because it is so experiential, and each room gives you that different feeling of a different experience. That is actually more akin to the idea of what Revelation was meant to do. And rather than holding authority, it's actually a document that was used originally, so we would argue in scholarship, to critique authority. So Simon talked about othering and bestiality and making people look like beasts. Revelation is saying, look, this emperor who you think so divine, he's a beast. This empire which is ruling everything, it's a beast. This city, your great city, it's a big prostitute, right? And she's going to get eaten and burned and destroyed. And so that authority of the text being so authoritative, it's reflecting, it's de-authoritizing the ruling system.
But this goes back to your point about the temporality of the different decodings of Revelations, and so that's how it works then. That's not how I receive it, because I haven't got that historical knowledge.
No, of course not. And it's not how everybody on the internet receives it. If you type in what does Revelation mean, I get emailed to me, Mrs. Fletcher, you don't understand what Revelation means. I've got the right.
Dennis, did you? No.
Was there a question over? Yes.
Just in terms of the technology, and I really admire what you've done. It's absolutely amazing. But did it? Revelation obviously is an incredibly visual text, but it's also experiential, kind of in a very immersive kind of way. So it involves a lot of things to do with hearing and to do with touch. And there's lots of references to like bellyache or terrible suffering or tongue gnawing. And just wondered whether it's possible, whether you considered bringing other kind of senses in any kind of way. There's lots of things to do with eating and... An
edible exhibition. I think we need an edible exhibition.
Well, virtual reality, as my colleague Drew will say, one of the key elements of that, which is often forgotten in contemporary times, is actually smell.
Revision 4.
Yes, indeed.
Working on it.
And of course, there are images in the Bible of the text of Scripture being ingested, precisely. And again, it's another way in which the materiality of the text is both accentuated and translated into something else through eating.
And traditionally, in artworks, that's been something that's really hard to translate, but with the technology now, do you think that it's possible to actually address it?
Well, it is certainly possible, but it was just not, for these particular pieces, it was just not something that came up. I mean, I'm happy with the technology that was selected for the different works of this show. Some of the things which people think are fantastic, like, for example, in the Horses Technology Room, there's a wireframe model which actually shows the emergence of the data, which you can control sort of without touching. There's an invisible hemisphere. People are like, wow, how is this done? It's like, yeah, that's a 50-pound piece of consumer tech that we modified to do that. There are other things in the show that are produced by literally 500,000 to 1 million pound systems, latest production technologies. I think the way that I generally pick technology is that it's, to use a very cliche phrase, you should pick the right tool for the right job. So I know what's available and I pick accordingly. Certainly engaging with the other senses is something that I would do if it would be appropriate, but it just didn't seem appropriate.
It wasn't really a reflection on the exhibition that you've got, because it's really, really successful from approaching many different points of view. I can't imagine how it's possible to actually come up with something like that, having worked with so many different people with a very, very, very particular text. I think it's just absolutely amazing. Because I was thinking about the future, really, and about the future possibilities of technology, because you've obviously gone into it.
Well, certainly with haptics, and Ben jokes about sort of an edible exhibition. There are now 3D printers that can print food. So, I mean, certainly we've been a very AV, audiovisual heavy culture for the last 20 years, and I think some of the emerging technologies we'll see in the next 20 are things about touch, or say sort of that biofeedback. So I think, yeah, I would agree with that.
Some of our lecture rooms already smell, so I mean, it's actually perfect. We're already in a new age.
Well, we can't eat or drink the exhibition, but we can eat or drink in the exhibition, which is what I'm going to suggest that we do now. After first thanking all of our contributors today, both those who've been an integral part of the process, which is the majority, but also especially to Simon for coming and offering his responses, which were very valuable to us. And just to pick up on one thing that Alfredo said, that he talks about how we can never renounce our knowledge, and we're not able to say no to our knowledge once we've got it. I think another very significant thing about visual imagery of any kind is that we can't renounce that either, that once it's in our heads, it's there. You can't expunge it. And in many cases, as in the awful art, which I couldn't agree more with Eddie, so much of which has been generated by this particular book, it's actually a wonderful thing to have some of the images you've offered us, Michael, and to have them unrenounceably in our heads. So thanks to everyone, but above all, thanks to you for this exhibition. And if you don't know where the Indigo Rooms are, they're literally just across this courtyard out there and then down one flight of stairs in the east wing of Somerset House. But if you're not sure, follow somebody who looks as if they know what they're doing, and you should end up there. But thank you very much to everybody, and thanks to you.